Hi, good afternoon.
Good afternoon, sir.
Good afternoon, Professor.
Yes, thank you. That's, hope I'm audible and visible.
Yes,
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 sir, you are audible and visible.
Thank you. There's some problem with my laptop. I couldn't connect it on Zoom, so that's why I joined on my phone. It took a bit of a time.
No issues.
Yes.
A very good afternoon to all of you. Good afternoon to Dr. Bhupati sir, Dr. Ambati Nageshwar Rao sir, and all the participants. For today's session, our eminent guest of honor is Dr. Bhupati sir. Dr. Bhupati sir is an assistant professor in the Department of English Studies, School of Social Science and Humanities, Central University of Tamil Nadu. Sir has research interests including disability studies, Palestine and West Asia literature, post-colonial and resistance literature, and life writing study. For his doctoral research completed at EFL University, Hyderabad, he has studied the identity construction of Palestine in the life narrative written by Palestinian refugee. Prior to the appointment at CUTN, Sir has taught at Aligarh Muslim University for 3 years. Sir has published articles in journals and edited books that are of international repute and presented research paper at conference both inside and outside India in his area of interest. Sir research work have been published by renowned international publishers like Peter Lang, Routledge and Routledge Journal of Life Writing. Sir is one of the few scholars in the area of disabled studies in India to introduce a special course titled Disability Studies and Literature to master's students of English Literature. Sir is a member of editorial review board of the International Journal of Whole Schooling published by the University of Michigan Press. Now I request Sir to take the session from here.
Uh, so very good afternoon to everyone present here. So thank you so much for the opportunity at the outset. Um, at the outset, I just want to, in a way, congratulate and appreciate the Gujarat National University Center for Disability Studies for the, for this summer school on research methods in disability studies, which is a very important, intervention, especially in the present times. Also, the center has been doing quite a number of interesting works in the area of disability studies. So my appreciation to the people who are involved in the center, my friend Dr. Marisport sir and Dr. Nageswar Rao and others for carrying forward the the kind of work that they have been doing. So in a way, I'm very glad to see law universities, coming up with the research methods, in disability studies, which is a very important intervention, as I said earlier, in the present times. So today, I'll be talking to you primarily on research methods in literary disability studies, which I believe is a very important thing because so far I don't see any sort of so I mean any article or book or anything has been written on this area. Even for that matter, research methods in disability studies in general, right? So in a way, when I was asked to speak on this topic, and when I was asked to sort of discuss with you guys, on research methods in literary disability studies, I was just actually sort of wondering, how I can orient you with the disability studies from my almost the 5 to 6 years of teaching as well as research experience in working on literary and cultural disability studies. One of the very important things that actually struck me, is to make certain disclaimer at the outset, in this lecture. Uh, as in literary studies in general, we do not deal much with method, right? Because as many of you who are part of literary disabilities, literary studies would be aware that in the last 15, 20 years or so, literary studies in general has undergone a radical change, has undergone a radical shift, from a linguistic turn to cultural turn. Now we are in the post, disciplinary field. People are talking about interdisciplinary, but I would primarily look at it as a post-disciplinary, in which you can do literally everything in the field of literary studies. So I was just wondering, disability studies or literary and cultural disability studies as part of literary studies is one such of an, in a way, intellectual projects that sort of entered into literary studies in the last 3 decades in Europe, in the West, particularly in global South, in the last, let's say, from last 2 decades, literary and cultural disability studies has entered into, our disability studies epistemology has entered into literary studies. So it is, as I said, one of the intellectual inquiries amongst other inquiries, like you see food studies, refugee studies, elite studies, body studies, fat studies, so on and so forth. We can go on, name it, right? But I was just in a way, thinking about how I can structure this talk, when I was pondering over research methods in literary disability studies. As I said, the first disclaimer I want to make it at the outset is that I do teach research methodology, in the PhD level, master level at my university. I always tell students that research methodology has to be divided into two: method and methodology. Method is something, the way of doing work, way of doing research, whereas methodology is something that actually refers to the perspective and the approach, or what you call, what you can, largely categorize it or call it as theoretical framework, right? So for this talk, I believe method is something is known to all of us, known to people who do literary studies, is basically textual analysis method that broadly falls within the ambit of qualitative research method. Okay? Apart from, you have a lot of narrative methods, interview methods, so on and so forth. But when we say the hardcore literary disability studies research, primarily what we do, or what has already been done by the scholars like Leonard Davis, David Mitchell, Sharon Schneider, Rosemary Golden Thompson, Alice Hall, so on and so forth. They've all looked at literary text, printed text, the written text. So I believe let's first start with, the kind of understanding that here method primarily refers, at least in literary disability studies research, as textual analysis or close reading, method, or close reading, reading closely the text, right? And methodology, as I distinguished earlier, basically refers to, from method, it is approach or ideology or theoretical framework, whatever you can call it. But in general, it basically refers to a perspective that we have towards the text, chosen text. And as I said, for this talk, I want to primarily, confine myself only to methodology, because there is nothing much to explore in terms of method, other than talking about, let's say, textual analysis method. I believe I'm also aware of the fact that there are a couple of texts like Griffin's very important text in literary studies, for example, research methods in literary studies, where he has sort of talked about, explained there are 10 important methods like archival method, interview method, visual method, textual method, so on and so forth. But I guess for literary disability studies research, at this moment, we need to actually sort of do more of a textual analysis research, because there is a lot to be explored. There is a lot to be researched upon. There is a lot to, in a way, study, especially in the global South, right? In terms of literary representation of disabled in the global Southern text. So in this sort of a context, I believe it is, in a way important for us to, today engage with the range of methodologies, perspectives that are important to, in a way, look at literary text having disabled characters or having disability representation. And having said that, having made this sort of a disclaimer at the outset that I would be primarily confining myself to methodology in literary disability studies, literary and cultural disability studies, I want to sort of begin my talk today by giving the the following sort of the categorization. So during my talk today, I would be primarily talking about two important categorization, which you can largely find. One is disability in literature. Second is literature in disability. What do I mean by disability in literature? I mean disability in literature, something that is actually refers to representation of disability or disabled people in literary writings. Second, what do I mean by literature in disability? I mean basically how literature has been written by the disabled. So basically, the literary disability studies can be broadly categorized into two. One is representation of disabled in literature by the the mainstream writers. Historically, you can find. Second is literature written by the disabled. So these two categorization are very important to understand at this juncture, because the kind of approach that actually that I will be talking about in the course of my talk actually in a way varies from this one category to another category. So the first thing is disability in literature, that is representation of disability in or disability, literary representation of disability. In a way, historically, scattered in almost all the literary writings, be it is global Southern literary writings or global Northern literary writings. But the kind of way in which disability has been represented, the kind of idea with which, a perspective with which disability has been represented historically from ancient period, or you can see it from Greek period onwards, it's completely in a way, varies from period to period, varies from one epoch to another epoch. You can see, because in the Greek period, disability was portrayed as a monstrous figure. Again, when you come down to the little more the Renaissance period in the European context, you can find disability has been portrayed as unhuman or non-human sort of a figure. During the during the Industrial Revolution, during the 19th century, you can find, or during the Victorian period, you can find disability was portrayed as something which is opposite to ability, which is opposite to normalcy, an abnormal condition, right? Again, in the 20th century, you find quite a number of ways in which disability was represented in the literary writings. So I guess it is important to sort of number one, historically map out this one side, historically map out this sort of representation. On the other hand, mere mapping out of the representation alone will not help us. We need to have certain approaches to map out it, certain approaches to study the pattern of disability representation. Like, feminists have sort of come out with the the understanding of how women were historically, represented with certain patterns, like patriarchal sort of a pattern, be it is a patriarchal pattern, or be it is any sort of, the power relations between man woman, relationship, or anything, or it can be anything else, right? So similarly, in the case of disability representation, also in the literary writings, there are patterns of representation. There are ways in which, that disability has been represented historically in literary writings, both in the global south and in the global north, right? So the under this representation of disabled in literature category, I want to primarily talk about um, four important things. The first thing is, the four important approaches that have come up, from the scholars, who work in the area of literary and cultural disability studies. Some of it you may be aware of it if you, have certain orientation with, literary disability studies or disability studies in general, because though we say that disability studies primarily emerged from sociology, Mike Oliver was the founding scholar of disability studies when his book, The Politics of Disablement, one of the inaugural book in the area of disability studies, came out in the year 1990. But other than Mike Oliver, the kind of intervention that has been made to disability studies, quite interestingly, came from scholars who were already working in the area of literary studies. For example, you can think of Leonard Davis. You can think of Rosemary Garland Thompson. You can think of David Mitchell, Sharon Schneider. You can think of Otto Koischen. You can think of Tobin Schibber. Or you can think of people like Sally Tremin. Right? So all these scholars, who were already working in the area of literary studies, got fascinated with the kind of couple of things. Number one, a renewed interest that was coming from disability activist group. They were saying that disability, I guess most of you might be aware, that is no longer an individual phenomena, is no longer an individual problem, it's a social pathology, right? The impairment and disability distinction. And the way in which they were evoking, the activist group were evoking the shift in approach towards disability from charity to right-based model, from medical to social model, right? So all these things in a way evoked a very sustained, very, very, what you call a diligent intellectual project in disability studies. Interestingly, as I said, began with Mike Oliver. So disability representation in literary writings, as I said, involves four important approaches. The first thing is narrative prosthesis. It's from the book, authored by David Mitchell, Sharon Schneider, brought it in the year 2000, narrative prosthesis. Disability and dependencies of discourse. It's a full title. And the second important thing is aesthetic nervousness, disability and the crisis of representation, authored by Otto Koischen, one of the very important post-colonial studies scholar. He has made only one contribution to disability studies, and that is this aesthetic nervousness book. And that has made a lasting impact in the area of literary and cultural disability studies. And even now, you cannot look at literary and cultural disability studies without referring to this book. And third important book is Disability Aesthetics. Once again, a book monograph authored by Tobin Schibber in the year 2000. Right? And the fourth important thing is it's an article, very important article. It is to do with the representation of blind people, blindness in literary writings. It is called Aesthetic Blindness, Symbolism, Realism, and Reality. It was published in the journal Mosaic, brought out, authored by David Bolt a professor in Liverpool Hope University, somebody who actually sort of is the editor of very popular journal in the area of literary and cultural disability studies. It's called Journal of Literary and Cultural Disability Studies. Right? This article was brought out in the year 2013. After that, you have a range of other things, like you have a post-colonial disability studies authored by Alice Hall and other things. But these four approaches are very, very foundational methodologies to understand literary representation of disability in the historical period or down the periods. Right? So let us first start with narrative prosthesis. So I won't actually go into the detail of what Mitchell and Snyder they're talking about in terms of narrative prosthesis. I would rather be drawing your attention, to this idea of this approach in terms of very, very cursory level, because if I go into it, it's a very brilliantly written essay. It would take, again, usually I take 2 to 3 classes, in my literary and cultural disability studies to explain this essay. But I'll try and sort of succinctly put it, in 5 minutes or so, as in how this, this approach works in terms of understanding the pattern of disability representation in literature, film, art, or anything for that matter, any creative work. Right? So if you look at the creative work, be it literature, art, or film, one thing that you find is disability is used as a trope, as a metaphor. Right? It is used as certain symbol, and it is not used to talk about the positive quality of disabled. It is mostly, you find, it is used to talk about the positive quality of non-disabled or able-bodied people, thereby discounting or ridiculing the character of or the condition of disability. In other words, you find that is this understanding of narrative prosthesis refers to the way in which disability has been used as a crutch to lean upon the narrative of the text, the narration of the text. So mostly you find this sort of representation historically occurring, starting from Oedipus the King, the very important play, coming down to Richard III Shakespeare, even Gloucester's and King Lear, or even any of the popular representation of disabled during the Victorian period, novels published in the Victorian period, or even in the modern period. You can find it even in the contemporary time films also. So far, we have not paid much attention to such representation. We have
Sir, I think you have muted yourself.
Sir, unmute yourself. Bhupati sir? Bhupati sir.
Sir, you're not audible enough, sir. Can you unmute yourself?
How much ever badly it has been in a way, represented, we have not paid much attention to it because we thought we were under the impression, or we thought that it was not important, to pay attention to disability, or even for that matter, and any marginalized identities. Right? Even for that matter, women, so I popularly say, often I say in my classes, right? Most of the novels written by women in the 19th century, if you look at it, they were against women. Right? So this example, I always say, that is Pride and Prejudice written by Jane Austen. You can find it written by a woman, but if you look at the beginning of the novel, it is actually against, what you call the actual right of a female to exist in the society, because the novel begins by saying, I quote, it is the truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of good fortune must be in want of wife. You see the kind of uh, representation of wealth in association, or the representation of women in association to the wealth and the idea of marriage, and how it was conceived. People like Jane Austen, who herself was actually a woman, So it was an understanding with which disability was also represented. It was not paid much attention till or shall we say, till the late 1990s. Right? So this approach, that is narrative prosthesis, refers to how disability has been used as a prosthesis, like the prosthetic leg, helps the person to walk, quote unquote, able manner, quote unquote, normal manner. The very introduction of disability, the very idea of having disability as a metaphor or using disability as a trope in the literary text as part of the narration makes the particular text, to use its narration, or in other words, particular author or the novelist to use his or her narration as a sort of a prosthetic one to lean upon the disabled character in order to depict the able-bodied condition. You can think about, for example, very popular thing is, Sophocles, the Oedipus the King. After having realized that Sophocles has has had a sexual relationship with his own mother, Oedipus, Sophocles decides to sort of blind Oedipus. Why? Because blindness was considered to be a fate worse than death then. Right? And it's a sort of you find here, blindness acts as a sort of a trope, acts as a metaphor to sort of what you call lean upon the narration. That is, whoever commits sin like this has to be not killed, but to be punished in terms of blinding the person. So you find Oedipus gorges out his eyes, and completely sort of ends up being helpless, stranded, in the middle of the play, right? And having two children on two sides. Right? You see the kind of a condition here. Same is the case with Rochester in Jane Eyre, right? So you find, and toward the end, this idea of narrative prosthesis does two things. One is disability is left behind. Second is disability is, in a way, what you call sort of put an end to, or disability is exterminated to the end of the play or to the end of the text. That's what happens in Jane Eyre. Though Rochester was totally blind, at the end of the novel, you find Rochester was at least able to see, and they were able to have some sort of a reunion. Right? Rochester was able to have a reunion with Jane, and disability or blindness is no longer seen as a problem at the end of the novel. In fact, it is in a way eradicated. Right? So you find this idea of narrative prosthesis being used as a important approach to understand the pattern of disability representation in the literary and cultural text historically by the the able-bodied, non-disabled writers. Even in certain sense, for example, you find Milton, right, who was a blind. The point I'm trying to say is that not only the non-disabled people, also you find disabled people who were carried away by certain sense of this normative ableistic ideologies, depicted disability in a much more negative manner. You find Milton in his very important Samson Agonis portraying blindness as a sort of a wicked character. Also in his very important sonnet on his blindness, you can find the very opening line itself, when I consider how my life is spent here, half my days in this dark world and white. So you see the kind of, the very, the mourning of, having lost his eyesight, and how this idea of mourning itself in a way results in certain sense of, you know, portraying blindness as a sort of what you call, not as a positive one, but as an absolute negative one. But this indeed, in a way, reflects what Otto Koizun actually says, in his aesthetic nervousness. That is how the society, looks at disability, how the society treats disability, gets reflected in the literary works. So, narrative processes has been sort of very important, approach in terms of it has been widely used, and you find David Mitchell, Sharon Snyder having applied this narrative processes to range of text in their own book, right? So I guess it is like, if you look at it also in the Indian context, you find many people like Tagore, people like even historically also Tiruvalluvar, in Tirukkural, they have talked about blindness or disability in a very, very negative manner, to at the cost. I mean, in a way, let me phrase it like this: they have talked about disability in a very negative manner, so as to talk about, or so as to hail the able-bodied condition. For example, Tagore and Gandhi, they had, as you guys may be aware, they had a sort of a conflict over the idea of freedom. Tagore was asking for spiritual freedom, whereas Gandhi was asking for political freedom. Tagore wanted to counter, Gandhi by writing an essay. Right? In his essay, Freedom, Tagore actually says, "Freedom without spirituality is like a blind man groping in the open air." You see the kind of a phrase Tagore has used here in order to talk about blind man. The freedom without spirituality for Tagore is like a blind man groping in the open air. And look at the kind of trope or metaphor being used by Tagore, by evoking blind man. He doesn't even use blindness. He openly says blind man groping in the open air. So if you get the political freedom without spiritual freedom, it will be like a blind man groping in the open air. Like that, you also find in Tirukkural also, there are certain couplets that actually talk about how, the educated person is like somebody who has two eyes, and the uneducated person is like somebody, instead of having eyes, two wounds on their face, So, that is like, we call it as a sort of what you call, moral text. The moral of Tirukkural is something that is like establishing how education is important at the cost of derailing blindness, at the cost of portraying blind. But it's not to accuse these writers. It is to basically make you understand. It is basically to approach, these texts from disability studies point of view, or from the theories of literary and cultural disability studies. We get a different understanding, different viewpoint. As feminists say, we need to reread these texts. We need to also reread these classics in terms of evolving these approaches like narrative processes. Right? And what is aesthetic nervousness? Aesthetic nervousness is again a very important approach, which actually says how, the idea of aesthetics gets into certain amount of short circuit, gets into certain amount of conflict when a disabled character in a novel is encountered by a reader who can be able-bodied reader, or who can be a disabled reader. So aesthetic nervousness, how they basically refers, to put it very simply, how the introduction of disabled characters or disability in the literary works evokes certain sense of nervousness in terms of understanding aesthetics. In other words, how it creates a short circuit condition, or how it actually short circuits in inferring the aesthetic quality of a text with a mere introduction of disability. So Collison says that in order to understand this idea of aesthetic nervousness, Collison says it actually we need to look at it from three different point of view, or this nervousness happens in three different levels. One is when the author introduces disabled character in the work, be it is a novel or a play or anything for that matter. The author himself or herself is part of the society which has a stigma, a very, very deep rooted stigma. Second is, when the author introduces the character with that sort of a stigma, because the character is nothing but the creation of an author who is in turn is part of the society, right? Who is in turn part of the society, who is a product of the society. So author creates the character with certain sense of stigma, with certain sense of normative condition, with certain sense of what Rosemary Garland Thompson says, the image of normate, right? So obviously the character gets to be introduced with a deep-rooted stigma, with a deep-rooted normative ableistic ideology. This is one, because the author, doesn't know, or most of the time the authors are unaware of the fact that how to introduce disabled characters. Same is the case with film directors. When you find, a blind person is a blind girl or blind man is being introduced in the film, the directors, most of the time they don't know how to introduce the blind character. Do they have to be introduced in terms of the existing stigma in the society, or do they have to be given some sort of a libertarian or some sort of the freedom or some sort of an independent rule they have to be given other than depending upon the society, right? So this is something that the nervousness, as Collison says, begins from the author itself, or author himself or herself. Second is when after the disabled character is introduced, when the disabled character interacts with a non-disabled character in the text, again, certain sense of nervousness is there, because already the author is confused, already the author is nervous in introducing the disabled character. When he makes the disabled character or non-disabled character to interact with the disabled character, or vice versa, there is a certain sense of what you call nervousness entails within the text. And the third important thing is very important. That is how a non-disabled reader, a disabled reader, a reader in general, infers the representation of disabled character in the text. For example, when we read Jane Eyre, when we read Oedipus the King, when we read Richard III, or when we read Maeterlinck's The Blind, or when we watch any film for that matter with a disabled character, how do we understand? Do we accept the fact that a hero appearing on a wheelchair, or hero appearing with a black glass on his face with a walking stick, like a profoundly blind person, can that figure be called as hero? Obviously, we won't accept the fact, because our idea of hero is something that actually feeds into the aesthetic quality of a film or quality of a text, because aesthetic itself is defined. I would be talking when I talk to you about Tobin Siver's thing. Somebody's body is feeling attracted towards other other person's body. In other words, how the presence of somebody attracts other people. That is basically the very diluted sense of aesthetics with which mostly the idea of aesthetics is being understood. Right? It is in literature or art or any sort of a filmic representation. So with that sort of a basic understanding, how, be it is in the film or in the literary text, a reader or viewer in terms of film would infer this disability representation, or the disabled in the introduction of disabled character. So Collison says that we need to understand the fact that the nervousness that actually one feels while reading the text with the disabled character is the reflection or is the reflexivity that is, that one finds in the society. The same person, when I read a text, when I get nervous because of the introduction of disabled character, when I go out to the society, when I interact, when I meet a blind person, or when I meet a person on a wheelchair, I would obviously come up with a lot of curiosity, lot of pity or fear. The curiosity is like how these people are leading the life, like, because obviously the same sort of a curiosity I would have heard already when I read the novel with the disabled character. Second is pity and fear. I pity for the person who's on a wheelchair or who is completely blind. Fear, I would immediately think, what if such a condition actually befalls to me, in the future? How would I react to it? Right? So it is once again, the kind of introduction of disability, as many disability studies scholars argue, or the appearance of disability, or the interaction between disabled and non-disabled, evokes series of questions in terms of pity, fear, curiosity, ignorance, or some sort of a surprise, some sort of a startling moment, revealing moment. A lot of things actually, in a way, come up in the first interaction, right? So question says this nervousness, has to be theorized in terms of two important things. One is he uses this, Rosemary Garland Thompson's understanding of normate, the figure of normate. How the figure of normate, is number one, heterosexual, number two, able-bodied, number three, educated, number four, it is Eurocentric, white-centric, right? And number five, it is mostly, male-centric. So Thompson says that the figure of normate in the Western context is somebody who's heterosexual, able-bodied, educated, employed, middle-aged white man. So this white man, is actually sort of the figure of normate. If you look at the society from this perspective, in the Western context, the percentage of this perspective, of this figure in a society is, it may be less than 5% or something. Another 95% of people are, in a way, discriminated one or the other way. But we are given to understand that we need to aspire to become, this 5% of people, which is highly impossible. How much ever we try, we will not be able to do so. Already by locating in the, or having been located in the global south, we are already removed from this normate figure, right? So we can only create our own image of normate in the Indian context. Instead of white, you can put upper caste, male, right? So upper caste Hindu male, right? So other than that, everyone else is actually sort of, discriminated. So again, that percentage in Indian context will be less than 3 or less than 4, something like that, right? So another 97 or 96% of people aspire to become that sort of a image, that sort of a person, right? Which is highly impossible. So Khoisan says this idea of normate evokes nervousness among the readers or among the viewers, particularly as he primarily looks at text among the readers. So he has analyzed the range of text, African text, Irish text, a lot of text he has looked at in his book, Aesthetic Nervousness, Disability and the Crisis of Representation. Right? And the second important thing that he actually sort of takes for his analysis as a framework is actually David Mitchell, Sharon Snyder's understanding of how disability operates as a trope, metaphor, that is taking a cue from the earlier approach I said, narrative processes, right? So how disability is used as a trope, right? So disability is everywhere. It's in the text, it's in the film, it's in the art, it's in the culture. Everywhere disability is there. But how disability is used as a trope, metaphor to hail able-bodied, non-disabled, people's lives at the cost of ridiculing, at the cost of derailing, the disabled condition. Something that is very important, in a way, framework by David Mitchell and Sharon Schneider, and Quaison is using that framework. So these are the two important framework Quaison is using to talk about the idea of aesthetic nervousness as a sort of approach, literary disability studies, theoretical approach to understand the pattern of disability representation. And the third important thing, very quickly, I'll talk to you. It's about disability aesthetics. So once again, a very important, widely, in a way, discussed text, which introduces disability aesthetics. As we have Dalit aesthetics by Sharan Kumar Limbale, as we have block aesthetics, and this book, talks about disability aesthetics. How disability aesthetics, or how aesthetics operates in the disabled body. As I said just a while ago, that how disability disturbs the idea of aesthetics. How it creates certain sense of what you call alternative aesthetics is what the book is actually discussing. At the very outset of the book, Tobin Siebert says that the presence of somebody in a way attracts other people. So that's a very, as I said just some time before also, as the very, very diluted example or diluted understanding of aesthetics, apart from a lot of understanding coming from the aesthete, from Walter Pater, from almost the late 19th century onwards, art for art's sake. We know the SIFT people who are part of literary studies would know how the aesthetic movement in a way began from Walter Pater with the understanding art for art's sake, this with this very important novel, The Picture of Dorian Gray, right, and the Yellow Paper magazine, right? So Sieber is saying the presence of disability, be it is in the film, be it is in the literature, or be it is in the art form, does not disturb the mainstream understanding of aesthetics, does not disturb the framework of aesthetics. Rather, it offers an alternative understanding of aesthetics, an alternative framework of aesthetics. Right? As Limbale also says, if think of beauty is a joy forever, in terms of normal aesthetics, in terms of mainstream aesthetics, for a Dalit person, eating the food, leftover food, is actually a sort of aesthetic. That is a Dalit aesthetics, right? And what we call the very idea of Dalit body, which is sort of very toiled and very, very black in complexion because of hard work and other thing, working in the field. That is the aesthetic body. Right? So similarly, you find Sieber is saying, appearing on a wheelchair, appearing with the walking stick or the black glass, on the face, is the aesthetic of disability. And this aesthetics, this idea of aesthetics, does not, undermine the mainstream idea of aesthetics. Rather, it augments the mainstream idea of aesthetics to be an inclusive aesthetics. So the very and Sieber is challenging their understanding, like Limbale, that is, the mainstream idea of aesthetics is inherently ableistic, is inherently normative, and that is the reason why when we read the novel, when we watch a film, we get into aesthetic nervousness, what Quaison is actually saying. Right? And in fact, Sieber makes a reference to this mainstream idea of the reference to Quaison's understanding of aesthetic nervousness, and he theorizes it, and he theorizes the understanding that how art form, in a way, can strengthen our understanding of aesthetics, can make us understand that aesthetic is not it's not to be understood in terms of exclusivity, that is it is only confining to able-bodied people, or it can only be evoked by able-bodied presence. Rather, aesthetics has to be understood in terms of inclusivity. So the very idea of inclusive aesthetics is what is actually being foregrounded by Sieber in his book Disability Aesthetics, by saying that we need to look at the mere introduction of disabled character, disabled people, or disability as a condition in the art form is not to be understood as something which is disturbing the aesthetics. It is not to be understood something which is evoking nervousness in terms of imbibing aesthetics, in terms of what we call consuming aesthetics, is rather to be understood as something which is augmenting the idea of aesthetics, and also which is something, taking forward the idea of aesthetics to the next level of inclusivity. I think one of the phenomenal understanding of disability, aesthetics given by Corbin Sieber in terms of expanding the terrain of aesthetics, in terms of forcing the society to make the idea of aesthetics to be inclusive, and which is nothing but a reflection of the inclusivity of disabled, or the inclusion of disabled that people talk about, the disability rights activists talk about in the society. Right? So how the inclusion of disabled or disability as a condition in the art form can in a way change the inclusion of disabled in the society. Right? So why do we see disability as, aesthetics as a sort of an exclusive domain or exclusive quality, which is in a way not including disabled, because disabled or disability as a condition itself is excluded in the society, and the artist or the consumers of art form in a way are part of the society which inherently discriminates, excludes the disabled. Right? So with this, we'll move on to the next important one, that is actually aesthetic blindness. The article Aesthetic Blindness, Symbolism, Realism, and Reality. Very important article authored by David Bolt. This article appeared in the year 2013, and you see the kind of within 13 years how the very strongly the approaches in disability, literary and cultural disability studies have been laden in the disability studies to look at to analyze literary text with disability representation. And in this article David Bolt is saying the aesthetic blindness, that is, aesthetic is exclusive of blindness, something which is in a way a continuation towards from Sieber's understanding of disability aesthetics. That is, as the blindness and aesthetics have been historically seen as unrelated categories. It's a very important understanding that David Bolt is making. That is, blindness and aesthetics have been historically seen unrelated because aesthetics is usually, as he argues, ocular-centric, is based on vision. It is centered on vision, right? So consuming image is mostly to do with, aesthetics, right? Or in a way, the image of aesthete coming from the book I mentioned by Walter Pater, the picture of Dorian Gray, or the very important magazine that was started to spread the ideology that is the movement that is art for art's sake in the in the 1890s, centers on ocular centric understanding, the visual understanding of aesthetics. And Bolt is saying blindness is not something that is exclusive of aesthetics. It should be rather seen as inclusive of aesthetics, because our idea of aesthetics is primarily based on vision, primarily based on consuming images, primarily based on the ocular centric perception. Rather, Bold is saying this has to be seen in terms of the what you call alternative orientations as well. For example, the tactile sense, for example, the smell, the touch, that should also be seen as the modes in which aesthetics is actually being understood. Most of the time we see aesthetic is being understood only in terms of oculocentric perspective. So, and he's discussing, he very extensively discusses the Maeterlinck's the play The Blind, brought out in the 1890 in 1890. He says that the blind characters in the play, because mostly the characters are blind, only one person is said to be sighted, that to the priest whose a corpse, dead body is only lying there. And the blind people, blind characters who are in the play, unaware of the fact that the priest is died. So they think that the priest is alive. They communicate to him in terms of visual manner. They ask him to describe the sun. They ask him to say all these things. And also, Bolt is sort of challenging or questioning the fact that how during the Victorian period, the ocular centric understanding was hailed, over other understanding. For example, a lot of plays he has given the range of characters, from literary text, from Dickens novels, from I mean, from other things, from other texts, particularly from Jane Eyre's representation. Also, the representation of Rochester in Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre, and so on and so forth. You find a lot of examples being given by David Bolt to make an assertion that how Victorian age was primarily prioritizing upon the vision, and with which the ideology or the movement of aesthetics began. And even today, it continues with the same perception that aesthetics means it's basically based on vision. So people who are blind cannot understand aesthetics. People who are blind cannot be aesthetically beautiful. That's the reason why mostly you find blind characters in the film. They're often beats in the film or in the reality shows. You find they're often shown to be aesthetically unattractive. They're shown, like they will be putting their heads down. They'll be turning to the other side while speaking. A lot of you find very deliberately they are being shown, but that the reality is not so, right? So in a way, this idea of David Bolt's notion of aesthetic blindness is very important. I want to understand the literary representation of blindness in the historical period or in the literary text, produced historically. Right. So with this, I'll move on to the next important category, that is literature in disability, literary writings written by disabled people. So I primarily want to look at this section in terms of four important manners once again, right? So the first thing is, disability culture. Second is disability embodiment. And third is disability memory. And fourth is disability intersectionality of disability. And the fourth one, is actually a common one. You can use it for the first category also, that is disability in literature. Disability representation in literary writings. But I'll talk to you how you can use it. Right? The first thing is disability culture. Some of you who are familiar with cultural studies, intellectual projects, might be able to understand what I'm actually trying to, might be able to rather relate to what I'm actually trying to say. In culture studies, we talk about mainstream culture and subculture. Mainstream culture is a culture which is widely practiced by majority, whereas subculture is a culture which is practiced by minority, oppressed, marginalized people. Right? So disability culture refers to the culture of the disabled, or what in cultural studies, in anthropology, what they term it as ethnocentric culture, ethnocentric identity, right? That is the culture-centric identity, one's own culture. Right? So each group has got its own culture. When you say Dalit, there is a culture. When you say queer people, there is a culture. When you say disabled, there is a culture. Refugee, they have got their own culture. So disability culture till or until 1990, when the disability rights movement reached its peak, was not acknowledged, was not accepted by the majority. That is, you can see that culture from the very basic fundamental diluted understanding, example of table etiquette. Right? So when you get into the restaurant, they give you food and pork to eat. Right? Let's say that I'm a person with the blindness. I'm not comfortable eating with food and either food or pork. And mostly you find the star restaurants, they don't have the idea of what you call the wash basins. They, if you want to wash your hands, they will take you. I mean, they first of all, they'll look down upon you. Second of all, they'll take you somewhere to the toilet area where you have to wash your hand, and come and eat it. Third of all, the very idea of dining itself is not inclusive. They give you a, like a hardbound thesis, like sort of a menu card, in which you will find all the starters, soup, and main course, and all these things. You are absolutely unaware of the fact that what is there in the menu card. Right? And they will. Another thing is, the waiter would end up asking the person who's accompanying you, "Oh, what does he or she want?" So you see here a kind of etiquette which is being boasted, which is being promoted as the neoliberal, as the modern or postmodern or the ultra-modern sort of a practice, an independent practice, wherein a non-disabled person, a sighted person, get to choose what the person wants by looking at the menu card. Whereas the blind person is always is at the mercy of the person who is accompanying him. Or if two blind people want to go out, hang around, and have some food in the restaurant, they're always at the mercy of the waiter, who has to explain, and who often is not willing to do so, because like he has to take care of other tables also. So you, from this sort of very diluted example, think about lots and lots of examples in terms of travel, so on and so forth. So absolutely, the culture that we have, that we practice as the conducive culture, as the ableistic culture, as the independent culture, is absolutely exclusive of, absolutely in a way, oblivious towards disabled people. So there is a certain sense of cultural conflict between the ableistic culture and the disabled culture. Right? And the disabled culture, in a way, promotes sort of the culture that is conducive to the disabled, culture that is accessible to the disabled, culture that is that acknowledges the the independence of disabled people. So if I'm given a menu card in Braille, I will be able to do so. If I'm given, let's say, the certain sense or certain things in terms of accessible manner, one will be able to do so, right? The disabled person will be able to do everything on its own, right? Once again, the social model of understanding, that is, one is, disabled not because one is having impairment, but because the society itself creates barriers, not one barrier, but hundreds of barriers. Wherever you go, you find barriers, right? So you find tactile path in the airport, in the metro station, in the railway station. But when you walk on the tactile path, you find mostly, people standing there, and they don't even know the fact that many of the times the non-disabled, they don't even know the fact that why, the platform is little up, certain difference in terms of the platform. They might be thinking that it's a design, it's probably because of it's a modern design to have a, certain elevated, certain, raised sort of platform, right? And they're mostly standing on the tactile path, right? So you find the kind of what you call, you have the things, but you are not able to practice your culture. When you practice your culture, you'll be marginalized. You'll be stigmatized. Oh, you eat with fingers, right? Right. So the idea of, the culture that we practice is in a way promotes an understanding that either before eating or after eating, or both the cases, you're not expected to wash your hand. Your meat is you're washing your mouth also. You're expected to wipe your hand and wipe your mouth. As simple as that, right? So I am somebody who eats with the finger. So what would I do? Right? So I would be taken to the washroom somewhere which is very, very sort of lousy sort of a place where I don't want to go before I eat or after I eat to wash my hands. But I'm being carried there, right? So I'm being in a way directed to go there. So you find a certain sense of culture. Disability life writing. This is where I want to talk about the very idea of disability life writing. Disability literature particularly began in the 1980s, late 1980s, with disability life writings. The range of autobiographies were written by the blind people, by physically impaired people, by deaf people, or people with autism, talking about their own culture, particularly mainstreaming or foregrounding their own way of looking at the world. And this disability literary writings rather, does or do two important works, as in the case of other marginalized writings. First is to challenge the mainstream cultural representation of disabled that you have, I've just told you in the first part of my talk. Second is to foreground the culture and identity of the disabled, in terms of what you call, projecting as the authentic culture, projecting as the true cultural identity of the disabled. So these writings written by people with disabilities, they talk about how they were being stigmatized. They at the end they say that how the world should change, be it as One Little Finger by Molinichev or any autobiography. Range of, you have hundreds of autobiographies being written. That's why I'm reminded of Kenneth Jenigan, who was the president of a National Federation of the Blind, the USA. In 1973, he delivered a talk, "Blindness is Literature Against Us." At the end of the talk, he actually says, the future of the blind, probably you can replace blind with disabled. The future of the blind, should not be predetermined. It should be self-determined, which means the future of blind literature should not be predetermined, should be self-determined. So he basically means that it should be the disabled people, or blind people, in particular disabled people in general, should be in a position to write their own literature, to tell the world that this is what their culture is, this is what their ethnocentric identity is, and whatever identity or culture or whatever representation that we see in the mainstream literary writings or films, is always false, is always one-sided, is always stigmatized, is always produced out of normative ableistic ideological framework. Right? So disability culture is a sort of a subcultural, identity, tries to promote the culture and identity of the disabled. Right. In terms of you have, disability literature being written in the genres like disability life writing, disability poetry. You have a very interesting, a lot of interesting collections of artistic poems. Like you have Tito Rajasi Mukhopadhyaya was very dexterously talked about his artistic self. You have deaf poets who have talked about the deaf poetry. Very interesting poem called Sign Language. There's another poem called What Is It to Be Like a Deaf? A lot of things they have talked about in their poems. And you also have disability short story. You have disability poetry. There is a blog. There is a website also, disability arts. .org. You also have personal essays being written by disabled people. In India, you have a website called Skin Story, where you find they talk about their gender, sexuality, identity, and so on and so forth. And what is disability embodiment? Disability embodiment, and again in disability culture, there is a book called Cultural Location of Disability by David Mitchell, Sharon Snyder, where they talk about how disabled can be historically located in terms of their own culture. So they look at the cultural identity of disabled. In their book, that is Cultural Location of Disability, and this book will be of use to you, use to those of you who want to look at disability culture, who are working in the area of disabled literary writings written by disabled people. And the second important thing, disability embodiment, and this again is a very important thing, is actually a sort of a raw material for disability culture, a raw material for disability literature. Embodiment usually you can find as Merleau-Ponty's very important thing, that is phenomenology of perception. Right? So he talks about how our perception, the very idea of phenomenology of ourselves, is based on our own experience. The experience is felt by our body, how our body feels our, or rather gives our experience. So when we go to a mall, right? So for people who have vision, they would consume the image of the mall. For people who are on a wheelchair, they would be understanding the mall in terms of sitting on a wheelchair. People who have blindness, they would understand the mall in terms of the tactile path, in terms of the the smell and sound, audio, in terms of the touch and the railings and other things, staircases or lift and other things, right? So, but nobody, nobody is in a way is free from having an experience of a place, is free from having an experience of phenomenology or embodiment, right? So disabled people, as we know, there are different types of disabled people, have different sense of experience, different range of experience based on their, what you call their embodiment, their understanding of the, body, right? The understanding of the experience based on their bodily limitation or bodily condition, right? So, people with multiple, you can understand that the best example is people who have multiple disability. For example, Helen Keller. You understand how she got to know about fire, how she got to know about water. It is merely through embodiment. It is merely through experience of the body. Because when she goes near to the fire, she felt certain sense of heat. When the water is being poured on her palm by the teacher, she found certain sense of, she felt certain sense of water being falling on her palm. That is where she realized, oh, water is like this. But for people who have vision, water means it's like a liquid with the color and whatever the color may be, white color and whatever it is, right? So embodiment, the disability embodiment is in a way refers to experience of the surrounding, experience of the place, right, by the disabled people based on their bodily condition. For deaf people, the embodiment is completely based on vision. For blind people, it is quite opposite. Other than vision, the embodiment is based on other things. It is exclusive of vision, right? So, I'm reminded of this disabled feminist. They talked about when the normal quote unquote able-bodied feminist, they talked about standpoint theory. Disabled women, they talked about sit point theory. So this as opposed to this standpoint theory. They said that this idea of standpoint theory is basically based on, it's an ableistic understanding of feminism. So we are sitting on a wheelchair. We want to talk about the sit point theory rather than standpoint theory. You guys sit on a wheelchair and look at the world, then you will understand different idea of women. Right? So your idea of women is basically based on able-bodied condition, like that they argue. Right? So I think it's very important in a way to understand how women or feminism or or women as a subject interacts with the disability when it is on a wheelchair, or when it is completely when the subject is blind, or when the subject is deaf, right? So another important thing is, so mostly this disability embodiment you find in the disability autobiographies. You read Preeti Manga's text, you read any disabled thing. I'll just tell you one incident probably that would in a way help you understand what I'm actually talking about. There is Jerry Ticken has written an autobiography. She's a blind woman from USA. She has written an autobiography called Blind Man's Bluff. Right. So she's a blind woman. She has got a child. So the child is almost 2 years. I mean, like 1.5 years, badly. I think badly 1.5 years old. The child is, the child has fallen down and hit somewhere, and it's profusely bleeding. And she doesn't know the depth of the wound. She wants to know the depth of the wound before she takes the child to the doctor, because if there is any first aid has to be done, and she would do it. She puts the hand, and it is not in a way I mean, the wound is little in a way sharp, but it's very short. So what she does is she puts her tongue inside the wound, and she feels, oh, it is very deep, and she immediately calls the ambulance. And the ambulance comes, and she takes the child in the ambulance and goes to the doctor and explains to the doctor, and that doctor, the wound is very deep. And she's showing in the hand like, oh, this much deep it is. The doctor asked the question, you're a blind woman, like how did you you're a person with the blindness, and how did you get this the length of the wound? She says that I put my tongue inside. She said, the doctor says, no, you'll get infection. And she says that, no, it is my own child, it's my own blood, I won't get infection. But leave aside this later part, just trying to understand how the alternative sense of the what you call knowing the things in terms of using the body. She doesn't have vision, but she puts her tongue inside the wound and sees how deep inside. So that's in a way a disability. That's an understanding of disability embodiment. I'm actually in a way talking about how when we read disabled autobiographies, we get to understand their experience based on their embodiment. How that experience in a way constitutes their culture. So it goes like this. There is an embodiment based on place, based on body. That embodiment creates experience. That experience in a way creates culture. It goes same for any person be it is non-disabled or a disabled person. Right? So the third important thing I want to talk about is disability memory. So as we know, it's a very vast area. You have memory studies project, a very vast project. But I want to talk about how memory and disability is interconnected, or rather, how disabled people feel they are in a way sort of foreground their memory to write their literary writings. Right? So in the case of, you see the kind of when you look at disability autobiographies, disability life writings, disability poetry, we find the memory is actually operating. It is not a wounded memory. It's rather a sort of a rich memory, which in a way surfaces in terms of disability embodiment, in terms of disability experience. So as we know that our memory is nothing but our experience, right? That too, a selected experience. It's a very, very selective, very, very chosen, very, very sort of, sort of predilective sort of an experience. It's basically a very limited, selected experience that that are getting stored in our mind, right? And that are being in a way, resurfacing, in terms of memory. And mostly in the disability writings, we find disability memory is something that is, resurfacing as a sort of as a fresh memory, which is usually in a way talking about how they sort of used, or how their disability in a way sort of um, created certain experience for them. So when we read Preeti Manga's text or One Little Finger, or any text, even for example, this Reshma Valliyappan's very important text, this the idea of how this the mental illness operates in terms of schizophrenia. My life as schizophrenic. Fallen standing, my life as a schizophrenic. So she's talking about how when she was having that condition, how she in a way sort of experienced that condition. So the disability memory in a way narrates or feeds into the disability, into the story of disabled, which is otherwise called as disability literature, as a very as a sort of a sustainable, as a sort of an important source to understand the the synchronic experience of disabled. So how at that point of time disability was felt, especially when we look at certain autobiographies which talk about progressive condition. For example, Shard Al-Shimri has written a very interesting autobiography, Head Above Water, where she talks about, she is a person with multiple sclerosis. She talks about how her sclerosis condition, that is MS condition, is a very progressive one. How she feels from one stage to another stage, from when she was 20s, how she felt that experience. When she was 40, when she was slowly losing the mobility of her hand, the movement of leg and everything, how she was feeling. And she is making a very important thing that, I think it's very important in a way to understand disability memory. She says that my body is my first home. Next is my actual home, the physical home, the material home. The body is the first home. So one should feel at home in one's own body. That in a way is important to understand the disability memory, the memory of disabled, when it is being written or documented in the form of life writing, or in the form of poetry, or in the form of any literary writing or personal essays. You read the range of personal essays being written by disabled, or the podcast, you listen to the podcast where they narrate the story, as in how they sort of had certain experience 5 years before, 10 years before, or in the case of acquired disability, you find how this memory is completely different. So finally, I am aware of the fact that almost late. They asked me to speak for 1 hour 15 minutes. I've taken almost 1 hour 25 minutes. I'll just wind up in another 2-3 minutes. I'll talk about another important thing, intersectionality. So normally we understand a disability is a singular identity. That's what even government also understands. That's a legal understanding. But disability is not a singular understanding. Disability is a gendered identity, is a caste identity, is a racial identity, is a sexual identity, it's a religious identity, it's a regional identity, it's also a linguistic identity, and it's a class identity. In other words, disability is not a singular identity. It interacts with gender, caste, class, religion, region, sexuality, language, rural versus urban, so on and so forth. Right? So when we do an intersectional analysis of disability, we understand the fact that disability is no longer a single identity, because the experience of a tribal disabled woman is actually different from the experience of upper caste disabled woman. The experience of somebody who was very poor, and who is disabled, is actually different from experience of somebody who's a disabled person living in an urban place in an apartment whose parents are salaried people. So, because living disabled life is a costly affair. If you're a blind, if you're doing a bachelor or a master, you cannot do higher education without laptop, and you need to have reading software, which is as costlier as the laptop. If the laptop is 35,000 rupees or 40,000 rupees, I wonder you can't get a good laptop even for 40,000 rupees today. So you see, minimum you need to sell out almost 50,000 rupees for a laptop, 25,000 rupees for buying the screen reading software, another 25,000 rupees for buying the scanner, right? So, and also the headphone and everything you put together, you see, it's a very, and also smartphone, right? It's a very, almost like it's highly costlier affair. Same is the case with person who is in a wheelchair, right? And the person has to buy a motorized wheelchair, because universities across India are not actually accessible for people with disabilities, not completely accessible. So you'll be given admission, and you need to fend for your own life, your own education, right? So you find here the very idea of intersectionality operating in terms of the two categories of literary writings I said. For example, if you have to understand a representation of Black disabled people in the African writings, African literature, we need to understand Nirmala Irwin's notion of disability and race, her idea of intersectionality, right? Or if you have to understand disability and gender in Indian context, we need to obviously refer to Anita Guy's or Renu Adlaka or Nilida Mehrotra, Nandini Ghosh writings. Or disability and sexuality, obviously we need to refer to Robert McCruber's notion of cripping the queer, right? So we have certain, what you call, the point I just want to make at the end is disability is not a singular identity. It's a intersectional identity, and disabled autobiography, whatever we do, be the second category, that is literature in disability, we need to in a way look at the intersectional identity of the disabled person, because if you only go by the mainstream understanding of disability as a singular understanding, I guess we are not doing it is in a way an injustice to the disabled representation, because it's once again we are committing the mistake done by the mainstream society. So to sum up what I actually said in the lecture, I said that I began with the disclaimer that methodology, I primarily look at in terms of two things, method and methodology. Method is way of analyzing, way of doing the research. Methodology is a perspective or approach. I said textual literary disability, literary and cultural disability studies primarily deals with the textual analysis method, particularly based on the available text in the available approaches. And methodology, I said, can be broadly categorized into two, depends upon, based on the two category of literary writings on disability. One is disability in literature. Second is literature in disability. Disability literature, I said it's a representation of disabled in literary writings historically. I talked about four things, that is narrative prosthesis, aesthetic nervousness, disability aesthetics, aesthetic blindness, and literature in disability, that is literary writings authored by disabled. I talked about again four things: disability culture, disability embodiment, disability memory, and intersectionality. So thank you very much for the opportunity. And if there is any question or observation, I'd be happy to address.
Thank you, sir. I now request all the participants, if anyone have any question, can ask. Yeah, Adarsh have a question. Yes, Adarsh. You can open your mic and ask the question. Anyone have any question?
Sir, I have a question.
Yeah.
Hello, sir.
Yeah. Hi.
Sir, kindly bring some lights
sir.
on the. Yes, sir. Kindly bring some lights on the use of vocabulary in the discourse of disability studies. How the vocabulary used as a tool or important tool in the discourse of disability studies, because often when we are we are doing research or doing something in disability studies, we forget to use the particular terminology or the vocabulary. Sometimes we use like rough words like wheelchair restricted or something like that. So kindly bring some lights over.
Okay.
Thank you.
Just a second. Yes. Yeah. See, I can actually. I mean, it's difficult for me to sort of. List out all the vocabularies. But what I can do is I can recommend you one book. It's called Keywords for Disability Studies. Okay. The title of the book is Keywords for Disability Studies. It's an edited book. It has 62 important keywords. Okay. You can refer to this book, and it has a very detailed description of each keyword, starting from ability, ending with representation, stigma, um, uh, all sorts of eugenics, all sorts of things. There are a lot of keywords that we use. I think it's difficult to actually list out all of them and explain it. It's actually, I need almost 20, 25 hours to explain, because each keyword is very loaded. And there is another book called Disability Studies, A Student's Guide. You can refer to that book also. That also has a lot of keywords. So these are the two books you can refer to. The first book I recommend you to read is Keywords for Disability Studies. Second book, Disability Studies, A Student's Guide. So two books you can refer to.
Thank you so much, sir.
Yeah.
Can I go now? This is Adarsh.
Yes, go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, sir. Good evening, sir.
Good evening.
Thank you for the wonderful lecture. And my question was rather a little away from the talk. And since the organizers were mentioning about your PhD work, and they mentioned that your PhD work was on Palestine.
Yeah.
I myself, like, I'm trying to work on conflict and disability. So
Yeah.
I'm trying to look at disability from the perspective of how conflict intersects with disability in India. I'm trying to look at
Okay. What are the
so
conflicts you're looking at?
how disability is caused by conflict. I'm looking at the situation that arise in Manipur, due to the Armed
Right.
Forces Special Powers Act and the
Right.
conflict between the state and non-state actors, and the
Right.
people who got,
Mhm.
who acquired disability or who lived with the
Mhm.
disability in those kinds of circumstances.
Right.
My question was that when you were doing your PhD work and looking at Palestine, maybe from a literary perspective, did you like come across like narratives of disability and conflict, or disablement caused by the Israeli-Palestine conflict in that sense?
Yeah.
If I'm making sense.
Yeah, I got it actually. I just want to I just want to tell you that, I got initiated into disability studies almost 2.5 years later. I enrolled for PhD. So my PhD in that sense is primarily on the refugee narratives of Palestinians. I did not look at the disability factor in that. That time I was not aware of it. So to the end of my PhD, I got initiated into disability studies in the last 4-5 years, almost from 2017 onwards. You can say like almost 6 years. I'm investing more on disability studies simply because I could relate to it and other things. And it's not to say that I'm not into conflict studies or refugee studies. I actually do parallelly that also. But to come to his question specifically, there is a book called The Refugee Status of Disabled. The refugee status of disability. So probably you can write to me offline thing. If you have my email ID, you can write to me. So I can sort of tell you the exact book title. It's Refugee Status of Disability.
Okay, okay,
That
sir.
book actually, you can write to me, and there are I think other a couple of articles also on conflict and disability. And mostly like people, they talk about how disabled people were affected by conflict. And in fact, there's like there is an autobiography I recently read, A Girl from Aleppo, Nujine's autobiography. So she's on a wheelchair and she's from Syria. So she has sort of in a way talked about how she traveled from Syria to European countries on a wheelchair, right? But that's a autobiography. But there are a couple of articles on this thing, conflict and disability. It's a very interesting work. You can, it will be a very good intervention if you sort of do this study also. The refugee status of disability is a very interesting book that talks about conflict, disability, and refugees with the disabilities and other things. Probably, I wondered, you cannot find exact sort of contextual reference to your context, but you can understand the kind of methodology.
Yes,
You can
sir, yes.
understand, you can correlate to it, and you can appropriate your research based on these things, and you can probably the theories might help you. Right?
Yeah,
So
yes, sir. That was what I
you
was
can write
looking
to me
for.
off list. I'll
I'll write to you, sir. Thank you so much, sir.
Okay.
Thank you, sir. Any other question? Okay, now I end the session. Thank you, sir, for such enlightenment session. I thank you on behalf of JNLU Center for Disability, sir, and on behalf of all the participants. JNLU will seek more enlightenment session with you in the future, sir.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Okay.